College football nerds here talking Alabama versus Oklahoma. Daniel had some stuff he had to take care of. May or may not be in jail. We'll see about bail. But for the time being, I'm going to be your sole nerd today to talk about these two teams. Obviously, I've got a slight bias for the Crimson team, but I'll try to keep it in check, and I hope you guys don't get too upset about it. Um, Obviously, this is a big game for a lot of reasons. One, whether or not Alabama wins this game doesn't necessarily lock them up for the SEC championship, but if they do win this game, suddenly you're down to a lot of tiebreakers. Conference win percentage kind of ends up being the big deal, and they're almost certainly a lock for the playoff. Two, Oklahoma still has everything in front of them. If Oklahoma wants to end their season in the playoff berth themselves, they really need to beat Alabama. Don't know that they're necessarily 100% out even with a loss, but certainly if they beat Alabama and run the gauntlet, beat Missouri, beat LSU, and end the season at 10-2, they're very likely going to be in the playoff themselves. And I think more than anything, when you look at these two teams, Oklahoma is an improved version, I think, of what they were last year in many ways. Offensively, they are better. They're still not great. In our metrics, Oklahoma's 85th in passing offense, 59th in rush offense. Defensively, we have them the fourth best scoring defense in the country, seventh against the pass, second against the run. Alabama has the fun distinction of playing the number 2 and number 1 rush defenses in our modeling system between Oklahoma and Auburn in the year, so that's kind of an interesting factoid. But Mateer has really brought a different dimension to Oklahoma's team. And I said early in the season, look, Mateer is not the guy that I think you necessarily want to win in a shootout, but if you're in a game that's 20 to 30 points, he's a gamer that's going to find you something. And I think that wasn't taken great at the time, but it's really, I think, proven true. Mateer has his moments of inconsistency, right? The Texas game was obviously a rough game. I think that had less to do with his thumb, honestly, than it did the fact that he probably didn't practice for a couple weeks. And I think it was the lack of practice more than anything, much like for Alabama fans, the game where Tua came back against LSU in 2019 and really dug a hole in the first half they could never get out of. It's hard for a quarterback that doesn't have live reps. And I think that's probably maybe affected him almost more than the thumb. Particularly, he was rifling balls just into the defenders' chests. But he's still kind of been shaky. And when you really try to bear it out, it's difficult to parse out what that means. But I will say, leading into the Texas game, defensively, Kent State, Temple, and Illinois State aren't a challenge. So you're left with Michigan and Auburn. And while I did note that Auburn is the number 1 run defense in our model, they're the number 77 pass defense. It's turned out you can throw on Auburn pretty effectively. And so I think there's something to the fact that Oklahoma's just played better competition to end the year. And so, when you try to figure out how things are going to work, I always think it's important to try to balance the idea of statistics and eye test and everything else, but especially to consider matchups and the way offenses and defenses operate. So the other side of the ball, you have Alabama. Alabama, obviously, a very, very good offensive football team. In our statistics, maybe not as dominant as you'd think. When we have them 19th passing, 72nd in running per carry. More notably, they're the 19th best scoring offense. But I will say, if you look at FEI, they're a little more generous. They have Alabama 9th. A little higher than any of those metrics would suggest. I think that goes to the fact, as we've talked about a lot, the SEC is extremely competitive this year, and Alabama's schedule has been so difficult that I think no matter what we do, and we do a lot of stuff to compensate, almost everything we do is opponent adjusted, you can't completely opponent adjust everything away when you're living in silos and schedules are so hard. One of the conversations I got on Twitter with somebody was trying to explain, if you're in a situation really like COVID, where you have everybody playing only their own conference and somebody else playing their own conference, the numbers between those two conferences are no more comparable than if you were to look at, an SEC team and say you run for 5 yards a carry and the Baltimore Ravens run for 4.5, you must have a better rush offense. Obviously, when scheduling is completely isolated, when there's no connective tissue, one, there's no way to actually opponent adjust without external factors. You can't use recruiting, you can't use anything else. But two, at some point it just becomes meaningless because the competition level actually is usually 50% of the driver of your statistics. And I say all that to say that Alabama statistically, again, in our system, doesn't look that great. And it's interesting, and I make a big point of that because if you look in our 1 through 136 rating, Alabama's only 12th, Vanderbilt's 10th, Oklahoma's 11th actually, and it frankly irks me a little bit that for much of the year Alabama's consistently been bobbing around behind teams that they've beaten and beaten every one of them. At some level, you have to consider Florida State an anchor, though our modeling system has Florida State 17th. In fact, you'll find that's true of most computer models. Florida State actually sits pretty high. They're a team that plays very well per snap, that has found a way to lose games, and mainly by missing crucial plays throughout ball games. It's maybe a sign of coaching or execution. I don't know. But there's something to the fact that Alabama in our system ends up being underrated, whereas something like FPI or even FEI that takes more external factors like recruiting rankings, prior year results, they're rated much higher. And I think that goes to talk about a lot of these factors. But when you talk about matchups, one of the more interesting aspects to this, in my view, is the fact that you have an Alabama team that can't run the ball very well against an Oklahoma defense that is very good against the run and pass, but particularly against the run. Extremely disruptive. They're very good at getting in the backfield, very good about speeding up timing. Venables' defense this year, if you really watch them in their big games, they run mostly zone. They do man coverage more as a changeup or in goal line more than anything else. And when they're running that zone, they really like to bring pressure. They will bring pressure from the corner position or safety position with some frequency, bring linebacker blitzes very, very frequently. And the whole idea is they want to speed the quarterback up and see if you can make a quick decision and get rid of the ball. I think it's something that gave Tennessee a lot of fits in Aguilar. Aguilar has not been the greatest decision maker for Tennessee, and you saw that in that game. He had a couple interceptions that were almost baffling, where he was getting pressure or felt things being sped up, and he just threw a vertical route almost blind right to his safety. You can contrast that to Ole Miss. Chambliss was a lot more effective in that game. And I think the thing that made Ole Miss more effective, when you really watch it, is how quickly they got the ball out. And they had designed routes that were really intended to beat zone coverage. I'm a big believer when you talk about man versus zone. Zone excels when you're dealing with an offense that has a hard time of being decisive with its throws. And that particularly is true when you have a young quarterback. And the reason for that is zone coverage gives you windows to throw the ball. And those windows open and they close. Man coverage, you can watch man and wait, and long enough, and a receiver is going to get open. It's not always true in zone, because guys float between zones, go from one zone to another, they come open, they get covered again. And in Venables' scheme, what you often see is a lot of room in the seams or a lot of room behind linebacker depth to the safeties. And it takes a good quarterback to understand where those windows are going to open, but especially to be able to layer the ball there. And Joey Aguilar couldn't do it. And that Heupel offense, which they used to be really wide splits, they've actually condensed that for a variety of reasons. Tried to make their route shorter. They still couldn't pass protect well enough. The plays took too long, and Aguilar, again, as a decision maker, didn't always understand or really speed up his clock in a way that he could get the ball out quickly and safely. They weren't able to exploit it. But when you talk about just a couple games ago, and you look back at the Ole Miss game, it's a different result, and I think the biggest reason is that Chambliss was a lot better at being able to see those windows. He was a much more decisive throwing the football, and they were able to exploit the holes in the zones. And really, penetration was a problem for Ole Miss, though dropping snaps and some other things were maybe a bigger issue. But, they scored 34 points and probably were closer really to scoring 40 or more than they were under. Just realistically, if you talk about breaks that they got or didn't got, I mean, there were a number of drives that they kind of self-imploded due to mistakes on their part. So all that is to say, when you look at this game, from the main matchup everybody considers, which is Alabama's offense versus Oklahoma's defense, I think the deciding factor is going to be whether or not Alabama is decisive in throwing the football. Oklahoma's going to get pressure. And Oklahoma's going to get pressure consistently and effectively. They are, again, their aggression, I think, is a rough matchup. When you talk about Alabama versus South Carolina, that was always going to be a difficult game for them because South Carolina probably has the twitchiest pair of pass rushers in the country in Thomas and Stewart, and Alabama's offensive line just couldn't handle it. Oklahoma isn't quite the same animal, and where the rush comes are a lot more physical. They're not necessarily the ultra twitchy freaks that you do get from South Carolina, but they are, third in the conference in sacks, and I'll say third in sacks by 1 sack for a reason. They are extremely aggressive and disruptive. And so, the question for Alabama, I think, is how do you try to make sure your offense is getting the ball out quickly, getting the ball out decisively? What are you going to do if things aren't available? Because they don't want Ty Simpson out there trying to play hero ball, throw the ball down the field. They don't want him to try to make this the game where he figures out the deep ball, because if you do, you end up in the situation Tennessee was in where they're trying to take deep shots. The quarterback held the ball too long or forced to throw. Either way, just didn't get rid of it, didn't just safely eat a sack, and created some huge negative plays for them in that game. And from a running perspective, I think it's interesting. I mean, when you really break it down from a line yardage perspective, Alabama gets, I think it's consistently about 2.7 yards, no, 1.7 yards of line yardage. It's about even with Ole Miss, is what really matters here. Alabama and Ole Miss are about equal in terms of the amount of line yards that they generate. And when you talk about line yards, what that's really saying is, how far does the offensive line manage to get you downfield before contact occurs? And the notable thing is that if you look at Ole Miss versus Alabama, Ole Miss generates about 1.5 yards per play after contact, meaning first contact to the running back is actually almost exactly the same amount. But Ole Miss as a rushing team, they get a lot more production once contact occurs. Their backs are able to evade things. I think it's easy to forget that, especially versus high-level defense, a large percentage of your carries are going to be 2 yards or less. The question is that how many of those 4 or 5 yard carries can you get? Well, if your backs aren't making use of opportunities, you don't get them. And Alabama's in a tough spot that they are neither getting the push to create large holes, nor are the backs taking advantage of those holes when they occur. And if that's the case, obviously you're not going to be able to run the ball. So, I would think in this game, Alabama's game is to try to play the intermediate game. They're going to want to try to advance the ball slowly and cautiously. Don't create negative plays. Don't get too aggressive. Don't be cute. And try to march the ball downfield with quick throws, intermediate layered throws being potentially your explosives. Because of their aggression, those intermediate throws actually can be explosives, because often they'll be in a 3-high shell or even single safety 3-high, meaning the corners are dropping with a safety over the top. There may not be a lot of defenders to catch a receiver over the middle when he gets that ball. One broken tackle can be a touchdown. And they want to avoid the situation they were in last year. So last year, Jalen Milroe struggled as a runner. They tried to do the same rushing offense they had done previously against LSU and to some degree Missouri, and had a lot of success with. So they said, hey, we're going to run the ball with Jalen Milroe as a power runner, set that up, throw off it. Oklahoma was ready for it. They clearly watched a lot of tape. They had a bye week just like they had this year. Shut it down. Milroe was not comfortable as a power runner. He is a hit the seam and go guy. He does not really run through contact. We've talked a lot before about how he's a very, very good athlete, but he's subtly not actually a great runner. It's just clearly a skill set that he hasn't really focused on developing. And so they switched in the second half, and they said, hey, we're going to run the DeBoer offense. We're going to run RPOs. We're going to read the field. Immediately throw 2 interceptions and took a 10-0 game and buried themselves. That's what you don't want to do if you're Alabama. Let's flip it around and talk about Oklahoma, because at every one of these games, everybody looks at the 2 great sides, the great units, and the truth is this game is 50% Oklahoma's offense against Alabama's defense. And I think that in and of itself is probably an equally interesting comparison, because when you talk about defenses, Alabama's not faced a defense as good as Oklahoma. Oklahoma's 5th in FEI. It's hard to face a defense as good as Oklahoma. But it's also notable that Oklahoma hasn't faced a defense technically as good as Alabama. Alabama's 9th, Alabama's 8th, Auburn is 9th, Texas is 10th. So, when you think about the Texas game and the Auburn game, Oklahoma had a lot of issues, a lot of struggles. Alabama's as good or better than those units. And again, offensively, Oklahoma isn't particularly good. And that's where I think if you're Alabama, the advantage is, you faced offenses as good as 46th ranked Oklahoma in FEI. And how to play that level of football. Missouri's 28th, Tennessee's all the way up there at 14th. But for Oklahoma, this is as good as they've seen. And I think that really is probably the bigger question. Can Oklahoma score? Can they move the football? We've talked a lot on our channel that our statistics keep flagging that Alabama's run defense is actually worse than their rush offense. They're 72nd in rushing yard per attempt, opponent adjusted, but they're actually 79th in rushing defense per carry, opponent adjusted. It doesn't show up in the FEI statistics, which I find really interesting. And what that all suggests to me is defensively, they've been pretty happy in having lighter boxes, probably between the 20s. They let teams run on them a little bit. They give them a cushion, and they start condensing when the field gets shorter. I think it's pretty notable when you look at older style Alabama defenses, the Pete Golding era, who's currently the defensive coordinator at Ole Miss. They kind of had an interesting profile, or however you want to put it, where their defenses would be elite in, yard per play defense, for example, but they would be relatively worse when it came to scoring defense. So, for example, let's take like the 2022 unit for Alabama. Yards per play, they were excellent. 4th in the country in yards per play. That was the 3rd best team in Power 5. They only gave up 4.59 yards per play. But if you look at scoring defense that year, not to say that they weren't good, but they were 9th. It was a pretty consistent factor that wherever Alabama finished, they would be generally worse in scoring defense than yard per play defense. 2021, Alabama was only 18th in scoring defense in 2021. But if you look at yard per play defense, Alabama was 11th. And so there was something about Golding's defenses that were consistently worse than the sum of their parts, or the result was somehow worse than their per play averages, worse than their statistics and measures. And I think it had a lot to do with their ability to make stops in critical circumstances, stops on 3rd down, stops in the red zone. It seemed like teams were able to out-scheme them to get an advantage or an edge when they needed to. I think there were certain aspects of Golding's defense, we talked about at length over those years, where teams kind of figured out versus that mint-style defense that Kirby Smart also runs, Lanning and Schumann in that tree. They have hybrid players in the alley, not going too crazy out of it, but it's a 4-2-5 defense out of a 3-4 hybrid. And that edge player is being asked to take on more responsibilities because of the RPO. And it seems like teams figured out that if you motion a back or you run the tight end, you usually can catch that edge player and drag them out, which 1, takes them away as a pass rusher, 2, probably creates a mismatch, and 3, it would often cause an isolation or predictability with who was covering what downfield. And teams, I think, were able to exploit it. Alabama's defense is simpler in a lot of ways now, and in that extent, they also are less assignment driven, more zone driven. That's given them problems against veer style offenses, which Oklahoma did to a tremendous effect last year. Because they're read and react, because they're not necessarily assignment driven, when teams are able to get numbers to one side and create eye candy in motion, Alabama tends to overreact to one player or another, and they tend to miss assignments, let guys go free, and generate chunk yardage. Also, being zone-based means it's a lot easier to get numbers because with man, everybody's chasing you. When you're in zone, if you flood a zone and they don't react defensively in terms of their call, they're going to get outnumbered. But the flip side of all that is the simpler scheme also means they can run zone much more like Venables. And they are a more similar defense, actually, in a lot of ways to what Venables runs than they used to be. They can bring more pressure. And against traditional spread offenses, they've been more effective. I will be interested to see in this game how much Oklahoma tries to throw the ball versus run it, how much they do attack the run, because Oklahoma themselves, bear in mind that they're not a particularly good run team. Maybe they're better running than passing, but they're not particularly good. And the problem is if you're not a good run team, even if you're better at running than you are throwing, you can't sustain any drives running the ball because you need 4 yards of carry to be able to maintain first downs and maintain possession. So you're better off throwing it and hoping you have a couple drives where things go together. But to the point I was getting at earlier, when you look at Alabama right now in terms of a defensive unit, so total defense, yards per play, Oklahoma's 6th. I mean, they're elite. But you're not going to find Alabama very high. They're 41st in the country in yards per play allowed. But the thing that makes this new scheme a lot better is in points per game, they're 13th. Alabama is much more effective in that regard than their statistics indicate. Oklahoma is 8th in scoring defense. They're, again, a little lower than their yard per play. And so even though Oklahoma is in many ways a significantly better defense, in terms of end result, how many points you give up, Alabama is actually pretty similar. And to me, that's probably the defining factor in the game. Because, look, I think the way you attack Alabama is you attack them by the fact that I don't think they have great depth at the defensive line. Their starting defensive line is very good. Looked it up, Keenan, Overton, James Smith. Those guys have been injured, which has been, I think, a big factor for them. The early part of the season, they did not have those three guys at the same time. Also, the jack linebacker for them, Russell, got hurt early in the year. So there's a point where I think they only had one of the four playing, somewhere around week 3, week 4, around the Vanderbilt game. But since then, Pierre, the jack linebackers, come on. Keenan, who had a sprained ankle right before the Florida State game, and was probably a crucial loss for them in that game, is now healthy. Smith, who was, I think, ejected in a game, is obviously playing now. And when you put all that together, I think their front four is as good as anybody's. The problem is their depth is not good. In the Florida State game, where they had to rely on depth to start, they were really in a pickle. And so if you're Oklahoma, it's all about sustaining drives. If you can't get first downs, if you're flailing, if you're going 3 and out, Big Keenan is going to stay on the field. James Smith's going to stay on the field. Overton's going to stay on the field. You're going to have a hard time moving the ball. But if Oklahoma is able to just put together some drives, and that's something I think Mateer can do for you as Oklahoma, that's going to let them give themselves the ability to make Alabama rotate, and suddenly you can run the ball. Suddenly Alabama's pass rush falls off quite a bit. Your offense is going to look a lot better. Xavier Robinson for Oklahoma, I think, is one of the better backs and more underrated backs. Again, from a line yardage perspective, they're actually right there with Alabama, but their backs get significantly more, about double the yardage after contact than Alabama does. Robinson's just far, far more productive. Much more likely to get explosives. Much, much more likely to generate yards out of contact or make something out of a play that's not there. You need that. Mateer, I started this video off by saying, look, I don't think he's a guy that's going to win you a 40-point shootout. And the issue is consistency. Consistency from an accuracy perspective isn't always there. Consistency a little bit from decision-making isn't always there. And if you want to score 40-plus points, you've got to be a highly consistent passer. But if you want to score 20 or 30 against a very high-level defense, the Michigan game being a perfect example of this, there are going to be a handful of plays a game that he just makes. He's an excellent runner, sneakily fast. He can outrun linebackers, which is a big deal as a scrambler and as a gadget runner in certain formations. And just his ability to sidearm throws, especially on the run, his ability to create off-the-run throwing, he's very comfortable. That gives you an opportunity to sustain drives. And I think that's the thing, if you're Oklahoma, you need to do. The offensive line is probably not good enough to get a ton of push on Alabama regardless. But again, if you're sitting there going 3 and out versus Alabama starters, if it's that kind of a game and you're not able to lean on Alabama's defense, you're going to have a really, really rough night. If you're able to, or when you're able to sustain drives, when you're able to get into Alabama's depth and get them a little uncomfortable, you can have more success. The other thing I'll say, when you look at Ole Miss and Tennessee, first, Tennessee's defense statistically, as it turns out, hasn't been very good. In certain ways, they're good. And again, it's a little crazy, statistically when you look at some of these things. I mean, defensive FEI, they're 31st, which isn't necessarily that bad. But when you look at their, overall profile, yard per attempt defense, rush defense, we have them 75th and 38th. And Tennessee's biggest issue is in the secondary. They've been banged up, and they just have not, as it turned out, gotten very good secondary play. I think their front is pretty good. But where Oklahoma had the most success against Tennessee was getting the ball in space in the perimeter, moving the ball, like screen game, breaking tackles, et cetera, et cetera. That's actually kind of a feature of Tennessee, or a flaw as it is. Alabama's biggest advantage is their outside corners, Avian Brown, and at this point, Dejon Lee are excellent boundary corners. They're big, they're physical, they cover well. You have to attack Alabama in the slot, I think, is their weakness. And so I think you're going to see a lot from Oklahoma trying to keep the ball really between the hashes, trying to attack those seam routes, trying to get the ball to the tight end, trying to get the ball in the slot, especially probably using Satania a lot in the slot, just doing little hooks and curls, and just get the ball moving until you can get some momentum. And so in a lot of ways, it sounds pretty similar, but the difference is Alabama's probably going to attack 10 to 20 yards depth. You're probably going to see Oklahoma attack somewhere around 5 to 10 yards of depth in the passing game, run the ball a little more than Alabama likely will. Alabama probably runs the ball a lot inside, as they always have this season. It's a function of the hurry up. They want, when they get a first down, they don't want you to substitute, so you see them run on first down inside a ton. That's very often because they don't substitute, get to the line, and you have kind of a called inside carry that forces the defense to be set. And doing that on a regular basis means the opposing defense knows they have to set the defensive line and they can't rotate from the sideline. And that gives Alabama kind of a continual advantage from a substitution perspective. Overall, this game slightly closer than the LSU game. The point spread's currently at about 5.5. LSU is around 9. I think that's fair. I think Oklahoma's about a 3-point better team than LSU, mainly because I think the defense is a touch better. LSU's defense is extremely good themselves, but I think the offense is the thing that's a little bit better and makes them about a field goal better than LSU in this kind of a matchup. This game is in Tuscaloosa, which matters. Alabama's not always played great away from home. And from our model's perspective, this is a game where, it does, again, not really love Alabama. And as I said, it's kind of irked me that Alabama's been behind teams consistently that they beat, which I feel like the model shouldn't be doing and normally shouldn't. But I think it says a lot about the fact that Alabama's production and end results have consistently exceeded their per-play metrics. And it's consistent enough that I think at some level you have to say it's about coaching and play calling and design, not just a fluke. So our model has this game, Oklahoma 21, Alabama 20.6. So about a 1-point advantage to Oklahoma. I will say that I'm going to go against that. I'm going to go with Alabama 24-17 over Oklahoma. It's not going to shock me at all if Oklahoma wins this game. I think they're more than capable of it. A score in the teens and 20s is where Oklahoma wants to be. They want to get 2 or 3 big drives out of Mateer where he finds something, creates something, makes something happen. And he can do that for you, and probably will. He'll put together a couple scoring drives in this game. Alabama's goal in this is, and they've been an excellent red zone defense all year, get the stop once that drive happens. Don't let them score. Do what you did to LSU, make that a 20-9 game. That's what they're going to want to do. And if you're Alabama, the game plan you want in this game is to mirror the Texas game plan. And there were some Longhorn fans that wanted to argue about me about how Texas shredded Oklahoma. And it's like, whoa, back up. Texas had 302 yards in that game. The offense scored 16 points. Arch Manning threw for 6.1 yards per attempt. Now, they won that game handily, but they did it because the defense largely shut down Oklahoma. They created 3 interceptions from Mateer. They had a punt return touchdown. But all that was based on Texas playing consistently, biding their time, and when they're in good situations, being patient to move the ball methodically down the field and score without taking huge risks. That's the game Alabama wants to be in. You want to play a little bit of anaconda football. You want to win this game the way you won LSU. You don't want to be overly aggressive because Venables is absolutely going to punish you if you do that. Everything he does on a frequent basis is around trapping you from being overly aggressive and to see if you're actually patient enough to wear down that defense. And if you are, you can score, you can win, you can get a lead, and then I think Oklahoma's in a hole. So as much as I say it won't shock me if Oklahoma wins, I'll also say it won't shock me if Alabama wins this game somewhat handily. I mean, I'm going to be surprised if Alabama runs for 200 yards in this game, but I'm not necessarily going to be surprised if Alabama builds, let's say, a 20-6 lead, or they've just got even a 14-0 lead at halftime, and Oklahoma throws interceptions that turns this into a 30-10 kind of game. Oklahoma absolutely does not need to be in that kind of game, playing catch-up, throwing down the field. It's going to play into Alabama's hands, and I just don't think Oklahoma is built to play a game where they're coming from behind. So that's what I've got on it. You guys let me know in the comments what you think. What do you think about the video and the various things I put forward? Give me a score prediction. Who do you think is going to win this game and why? Don't say the Crimson team. And yeah, if you've watched this long, if you've been following our channel, please like and subscribe. As with a lot of channels, most of you guys, viewers, are not subscribed. Share this video wherever you talk college football. And yeah, I mean, Daniel will be back next week. And if you want, you can check out my video tomorrow where I talk about why Julian Sayin is bad at pickleball. So Anyway, thanks for this week. Good night, everybody. God bless.